We do have a distinguished panel assembled, and I think we ought to just go right through the group once with names and organizations and positions so that people have some frame of reference. And Nick, why don't we start with you?
Hello, my name is Nick Rasmussen. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism.
Good afternoon. My name is Courtney Gregoire, and I serve as the Chief Digital Safety Officer for Microsoft.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Fishman. I lead a policy team that focuses on dangerous organizations at Facebook. I think that's why I got the high chair.
My name is Marc-André Argentino. I'm a research fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization and the Global Network on Extremism and Technology.
Hi, everyone. I'm Megan Squire. I'm a professor of computer science at Elon University. I also have a fellowship with the Southern Poverty Law Center and a Belfer Fellowship at the ADL.
Hello, I'm Susan Abrams, and I'm CEO at Illinois Holocaust Museum.
Hi, I'm Alex Walden. I lead Google's global human rights work.
Hi, I'm Vidhya Ramalingam. I'm founder and CEO of Moonshot.
And I see that Nick Pickles is with us remotely. Nick, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you. My name is Nick Pickles. I lead the public policy, strategy, development, and partnerships team at Twitter. And sorry I can't be there with you all.
And I would say to the technicians, I am having a hard time hearing anybody. So if we're going to moderate, if you expect me to moderate the discussion, we probably should turn up the volume a little bit. Just so that we have some frame of reference, the description of this session in the program materials says, the technological age has brought new tools for hate groups to spread their message and recruit new members. From the live streaming of extremist acts to the grooming of the perpetrators of hate crimes, social media technology allows for the rise of global networks of hate that require global responses. In this session, panelists will discuss the ways that the tech community currently combats the use of technology to spread hate and extremism and provide suggestions for how those efforts can be enhanced and strengthened. And really, there have been comments made throughout the day that capture, sometimes in stronger terms, those sentiments. We heard this morning a panelist say that the way we maintain the internet landscape now will have a major impact on democracy and democratic society. We heard someone early this afternoon say with some feeling that social media is a super spreader of hate. And I think there is a belief that people with ill intentions have found ways to use this technology to disadvantage individuals, to disadvantage groups, and in some ways to wound democracy. When we got together for a pre-panel planning session, Brian Fishman from Facebook was the first one to speak up, and so I said in my note back to everyone, that seemed to work well. Brian, why don't you go first when we get to the actual program too? And Brian had suggested that he might talk about the trend line in policies at Facebook and also talk about some of the significant problems that need to be confronted in the task of monitoring what is produced and spread in social media. Brian?
Sure. Thank you so much, and thanks to everybody for the opportunity to be here. It really is a pleasure, and it's great to be on a panel with a bunch of folks that I respect a great deal, and to have the opportunity to be here in Pittsburgh, even if we memorialize a really horrible incident, obviously. It's obviously a moment when Facebook is in the news, even more than normal. I will echo my colleague David Tesler's comments this morning. I'm not going to go into the leaks in a tremendous way, but I am happy to talk about them afterwards. And in particular, if folks have questions about the leak last week of our dangerous organizations and individuals list, which I think is an important document, and the version that was leaked is not totally complete in important ways. But I think it shows the breadth of the risks that we face, both as a society and as a social media platform. On that list are groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and various incarnations of them, ranging to a whole host of white supremacist organizations, militia organizations, and the rest. And I think that one of the sort of core messages there is that all of these problems that manifest in society, manifest all over the world, they're able to come together in digital space, and people can find each other. And the challenge for those of us playing defense is to identify who those people are, how they're interacting, and try to disrupt that as best we can. The core message, I would say, is that that is an adversarial process every day. When we put one protection in place, they change their operations. And so I think oftentimes this gets discussed in public as if there are these big policy choices, and those do exist. I don't mean to minimize that. They do exist. But oftentimes what's happening on a day-to-day basis, it's a street fight. We are trying to adapt as we see what folks on offense are doing to try to disrupt what they do and keep them off the platform. So let me give you just a little bit of a framework that is often used in the industry, and Camille Francois, I think, probably wrote about it the most, from formerly of Graphica, in the way that policies can work on the internet. Because there are sort of three big buckets in the way that policies designed to keep bad actors off can operate. One is that they can identify content, bad content, right? And so this might be hate speech. This might be graphic violence. This might be, you can think of bullying. You can think of all sorts of things that you would identify and say, we're not going to allow this because of what's written down or what the picture is or whatever it is. So content-based policies. Then you can have policies that are based on behavior, right? This is not necessarily that an actor is doing something or has written something bad, or they're showing a picture of something bad, but they are misrepresenting themselves somehow. Or they're doing something in a way that disrupts the functioning of the platform. So the classic example of this is spam, right? Where you've got spammers that are just shoving stuff out, right? But there are more nefarious versions or more politically charged versions of that. If you are pretending to be somebody that you're not and misrepresenting a political organization or an individual or something like that, you may not even be saying anything that's untrue, but through that kind of misrepresentation, you are spreading disinfo. And that's an important way, and there are policies you can structure around that framework. What is the behavior that you don't like? And then the last is based on the actor. And the policies that I work on most directly are focused on actors. And that means this is focused on who the speaker is. This should give everybody pause. These, in many ways, are our most effective and sweeping policies for disrupting terrorists, hate organizations, dangerous actors on the internet. But it's us saying, you can't use Facebook because you're ISIS. You can't use Facebook because you're the KKK. You can't use Facebook because you're Atomwaffen Division. You can't use it to post puppies, pictures of kittens or puppies, or talk about the weather. We don't want you, regardless of what you're doing on the platform, because we think that you are so dangerous, we don't want you there at all. And I think that those range of policies, I think, and those range of different approaches, it's useful for folks to think about, because really what we're seeing, and what we're seeing a lot of in the Facebook world, like the actor-based approach allows you to take a much broader, sweeping action against bad actors. So there would be folks, probably not that many in this room, but there are folks in the world that say it's too sweeping. And I think, but what we're seeing with content-based approaches, where you've got hate speech, where you've got folks that are sort of, binding themselves together based on memes, or these sorts of things, is that it's harder to take sweeping approaches based on content, because you kind of have to look at each piece of content. And I think that what we're seeing is an evolution over time. And my colleague David, I don't know if you remember the sort of 4 quadrants that we showed, is there is an evolution over time in the way that bad actors are representing themselves on the internet, is they're moving away from the very easily branded stuff that we can take down based on an obvious association with an organization or an event or whatever, or an individual, and moving into its more subtle ways of representing themselves. Now that's not, there are definitely counterexamples, there's lots of counterexamples, but I think that trend is real. And that trend is hard to deal with from a platform perspective. Because it puts you in a position where you've got to really understand who those actors are, or what, based on behavioral signals, or you've got to really look piece by piece at the content, which is slow. I mean, it just is slow. And there are imperfections in the way that operates, using human beings or using AI. And so I think that trend is something that we're looking at. And the last couple things that I wanted to say is, the evolution of the Facebook policy over time focused on those organizations. Now we call it the tier 1, right? Last year, in response to some of the things that we saw happening, we developed 2 new things. One was a policy focused specifically around what we called militarized social movements, which is like militias and groups that are advocating for violence in political protests, or organizing violence in the midst of political protests. And a policy around what we called violence-inducing conspiracy networks. These are a little bit sort of non-traditional, and VICN, or VICN, refers really to QAnon, right? It was applied to QAnon. That's the policy by which Facebook took action against QAnon. But that required some policy creativity. And to get there, I think it's really important to recognize we're looking to researchers of the kinds of folks that are in this room, including, on this panel. Including Mary McCord and the work that her center at Georgetown did around militias was really, I don't know if she knows this, but it was really useful and informative as we were developing those policies and trying to build that out. And so the point that I'd end with is I do think this network here is having an impact in a positive ways already on the kinds of decisions that social media platforms make and the enforcement structures that they put in. But we can do more. And the one thing that I wanted to end with, and I'm sorry that I'm rambling on too long, I apologize, Mark, is something that I think might be useful, and particularly because our gracious hosts, Jones Day, have been so gracious, I'm going to sort of suggest something they might want to do, which is that we've just had 2 panels that are looking at civil and criminal ways to go after hate organizations. I think it would be useful to look around the world at ways that hate organizations and terrorist organizations are trying to use the law back at the folks that are trying to impede them. Because they are around the world. And we're running into that in a variety of places. And I think that this is something that is not well understood, and is something that the kinds of folks that are gathered here today might be able to pull something together and understand that dynamic a little bit better. So thanks very much. I really do appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I will be quiet now.
Well, we are looking for a manageable number of projects to take on between this summit and the next summit, and that certainly is a worthwhile suggestion. Let me turn to Nick Pickles, who is from Twitter and who again is joining us remotely. I know, Nick, that you wanted to talk a bit, or were willing to talk a bit, about the different approaches taken by different platforms and also what you described as the co-opting of the media.
Thank you, and also thank you for allowing me to speak higher up the order. Even with Brian's remark, I had to strike a few things that I was planning on saying. So I think with this illustrious panel, I certainly would be struggling for interesting things to say. I joined Twitter 7 years ago, and the landscape in this space is has transformed beyond recognition since 2014. I think that's true every year, let alone every 7 years. I just want to echo a few points that Brian made and perhaps offer Twitter's perspective. Firstly, this idea that bad actors are adaptive. It's often said that technology moves faster than policy. I think what we're also seeing now is movements, hate groups, moving faster than policymakers in their use of technology, which is a challenge for everybody because it feels like the solutions we're designing might work for the previous movement, the previous threat, but they're not keeping pace. And I think Brian's point that I want to underline is this evolution of communities rather than ideologies. I think perhaps in the past we've looked at ideology being something that's defining, but now kind of these looser associations, more social, more based on kind of perhaps what you would have seen in the gang space, rather than traditional terrorist movements. Secondly, I think the expectation of services is changing, but they also feel quite opaque. I think the trade-offs between preventing harm, tackling hate, but also protecting free expression and ensuring that decisions made in one part of the world don't have unintended consequences in other parts of the world, it is harder than ever. And Brian called out conspiracy theories as a very good example of how that line becomes very difficult. And also, in some cases, I think governments themselves are struggling. There was an excellent paper looking at, even among the Five Eyes countries, how they don't always align on designations. And even between the State Department, the Treasury Department, you see differences in approaches. So in terms of the two areas you touched on, I want to just think about looking towards the future. I think the ecosystem is bigger than it ever has been. And for all the talk of big tech and centralization, actually the long tail of services, be they content distribution, messaging, forums, is actually growing significantly. And a huge number of those services are being exploited, but perhaps not particularly used in the same circles as policymakers, and so rarely discussed in those areas. Secondly, I think this is a reflection of sophistication in messaging that's often not understood, but the co-option of mainstream media to amplify the kinds of, and again, perhaps not the same kind of clear calls to action that we saw from terrorist movements, but more subtle dog whistles, phrasing, ideological markers that you do see being seeded. And I'm a big fan of Ryan Halliday's book, Trust Me, I'm Lying, written before really sort of social media was part of that landscape, talking about how things can be, if you like, seeded on blogs, on small community pages, and then slowly traded up the media food chain to where they find themselves in this national spotlight, but from very, very small local seeds. And often that's a reflection of things like pressure on news organizations and also co-option by political factions. There's also the tension between platforms. In some meetings, Brian, Courtney, Alex, and I will be told coordinate more, align more, drive the same outcome, and then in different meetings we'll be told the exact opposite. And I think it is important that we bear in mind different platforms having different rules is a good thing. It's a good thing for free expression, it's a good thing for competition, it's a good thing for a diverse range of perspectives. And so if you look at a platform like Twitter, there is content that we would allow, and we would put a warning label over saying this is sensitive content. It could be the aftermath of an attack. It could be bystander footage. It could be victims telling their story and showing their experience. Other platforms might not allow that because it doesn't fit with their users and their commitments to protect them. And that's okay. But we need that diversity so that there is a space for people to share sometimes the most harrowing, the most upsetting of content. At the same time, one of the challenges we've seen is if there is perhaps a message in a manifesto, a message in a broadcast, even screenshots from broadcasts produced by offenders that then reappear in the mainstream media, the moderation challenge for companies is severe. And if we look to the Christchurch attack, for example, more than 2/3 of people who saw the Christchurch attack video on Twitter saw it after it had been posted by a verified account. and a number of those accounts belong to media organizations. So we do need to have a conversation there. And Twitter produces Moments. Some of you may have seen that, where we curate content on the platform. And we have a policy of not using attackers' names in that. So I think there's some lessons there we can use. And then finally, I'll just warn on the trade-offs in policy that are inherent in many of these decisions. The word terrorism, the word extremism are often used in very politically loaded contexts, and not always with a democratic and values-based framework behind it. And so as we're having these policy conversations, from a Twitter perspective, last week we published a paper talking about protecting the open internet while passing regulations and changing the norms around the online space. And so I think we have to keep going back to those first principles of how do these policy decisions also affect the bigger question of a free, global, secure, open internet, because that's the thing that has driven so many of the activists, the human rights voices, and the social causes that have enabled us to, as Brian said, tackle some of these very distressing but urgent social issues. So I'll wrap there and look forward to questions from the audience later.
Courtney, Microsoft deals with a range of products. How does that affect the challenge of assessing risk in your operations? And do you have some opening thoughts, at least, on the advantages and disadvantages of self-regulation as opposed to regulation from the outside?
Sure. Well, it's interesting to offer a perspective from a 45-year-old technology company. And I leave that right there. Microsoft is a 45-year-old technology company who really, since our origin, has understood that there's a concept of how technology can empower us, but there's always a risk that it could actually endanger us as well. So let me take you back to one of those first products. Yes, that's Microsoft Word. If we just think about the concept of a word processing document, we know that in and of itself, it could be used for great things and it could be used for evil. And as you think about today's plethora of products across Microsoft, whether it's Xbox Live Gaming to LinkedIn social media for professionals, to Outlook email or OneDrive file sharing, and a growing range of educational offerings in the COVID environment, we have to think about how to address digital safety from a comprehensive perspective, acknowledging that each product needs its own type of approach. The risks vary from a community of gamers to consumer productivity tools. And so just as we've been talking about how one size does not fit all, if we think about the right framework across the technology industry, it's interesting from how we think about it just by operating and delivering a range of products and services. We, at our heart, know, with the origin of thinking about how technology can be a tool, but it can certainly also be a weapon, have always had a no-tolerance position and no tolerance for hate speech across our services. But as articulated before, how you tackle that from a policy perspective as a tech platform, how you talk with government regulators, and how you really start getting to solutions are kind of a different thing. So let me acknowledge that there have been offerings, or I should say, attempts at thinking about this from a legal and regulatory construct. We've seen in democratically thinking countries struggle to balance freedom of expression and human rights as to how they are going to regulate content online and not understand the right boundary. Let me be clear, if we're thinking about the appropriate regulatory structure in a truly universal commitment to human rights, then we need to acknowledge there's a line between illegal content and harmful content. And as regulators around the world think about different constructs for how they think about that, if they're looking at illegal content, we may, as technology companies, see more automatic takedown requirements or other types of direct action against that content on our technology and platforms. And in the construct of illegal content, that could make sense. When it comes to how regulators need to think about harmful content, you're going to have to hold us to a higher standard. But legislatively, legally, that's going to be had to look at from a process perspective, because the terms of service and the community guidelines that are governing how that's going to be handled are up to our individual platforms and services. They are not enshrined in law. And we see regulators around the world struggling with that. We've seen voluntary commitments like the EDU Code of Practice, which I believe all of us signed on to address illegal hate speech some 4 years ago, immediately come into conflict with the EU privacy legal frameworks. And technology companies are the ones left to think about how to strike that balance. We know we need to have these conversations across these multi-stakeholder spaces. And that's why I am here really to say, I think the best type of approach here is when we acknowledge the whole of society problem we're trying to address. Because we need to make sure that those commitments that we take from a technology perspective are informed with the conversations we need to be having with governments facing different risks, with civil society facing different risks, with victims organizations who can uniquely tell us about the experiences that can help light up technology to be for good and less for evil. When I talk about multi-stakeholderism, I have to say that I think there's a couple principles for that. One, we need to create this space where all of those voices are around the table and they're not going to agree all the time. Too often we're in a bilateral conversation between tech and government, between tech and civil society, or civil society talking to government. It's why the Global Internet Forum for Counterterrorism is such a unique space. It's why the Christchurch Call to Action is a unique call to bring those voices around the table and acknowledge we have to be working together to make meaningful change. We cannot legislate ourselves out of this problem. We cannot litigate ourselves out of this problem. We are going to have to find true commitment to make progress to address the challenges of, honestly, anti-hate that span the real world and that online world. Microsoft is in about our 7th year of investing in what we think is important from education and broader awareness on these issues, what we call our digital civility research. So for the last 7 years, we have polled in over 20 countries how individuals are feeling about their online engagements. I have to say, one of the most surprising parts has been to see at the beginning of the global pandemic an actual feeling that the online world was more civil. That was quickly turned around last year when the experiences online not just returned to the uncivil engagements that we're here talking about, but really took a nosedive. And users around the world from 22 different countries told us the solitary environment they were living in actually made them feel that the online environment took a turn for the worse. That research is really at the core of some of the conversations we want to be having. Think about that. Those that are solitary, that don't feel they have a community, turn online and find that to be less civil. When they need is more community. We need to find a way to turn that technology back to that empowering and less to that endangering. And I think that's part of the conversations we get to have. So I look forward to further it. Mark?
Thanks. And Alexandria, you too were interested in saying something about the need for different approaches, but also the need for coordination. And I think you had some thoughts about regulation that you're willing to share too. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for inviting Google to be part of the panel today. It is always the hardest job to come as the last of the companies because I think, as maybe Nick and several others alluded to, over the past 6 to 7 years, we have had a significant learning curve that we've been on together. And so some of the core pieces of our approaches actually I think are very similar. And so I don't want to sort of restate the generalities, and I think Courtney hit on the major points related to regulation. So let me just add, specific to Google's approach, we prohibit hate speech and incitement to violence across all of our platforms, and that includes a variety of different types of services. And so that means that those policies look a little bit different across each one of them. Our approach, as we've sort of framed it, is called the 4 R's. We talk a lot about removing content, but we also talk about how we reduce bad content, how we can reward and raise up positive content and authoritative content. And so that is how we think about the approach overall across all of our services. When we're talking about platforms like YouTube, where we have clear guidelines and it's a hosted content platform, removal is a significant portion of the way we think about how we moderate content. When we're talking about search, a space where we aren't hosting the content and we are merely indexing the sort of the URLs that exist from across the internet, We want to think about that differently. And so in that case, we're thinking more about how do we reduce bad content, how do we raise up authoritative and relevant content. And so those are just a few examples of sort of how complicated it is inside of a company to think about how do we really address this problem, and it needs to look different across the different types of services, because they're abused in those services are abused in different types of ways. And then that also mirrors onto our conversation about regulation. When we're talking about regulation, we really need to have the conversation with governments, with regulators, and with our civil society partners about how we can address these problems. How do we address bad content, bad actors, bad behavior, while at the same time ensuring that we are respecting human rights. My work on human rights inside the company means that I'm having a conversation constantly with my colleagues about how do we keep our users safe? How do we ensure that we are not creating a place where bad actors can exploit our platform? But also, how do we ensure our commitment to freedom of expression? How do we ensure our commitment to privacy, to freedom of assembly, and all of the other ways in which people can use our platform for good? And so I think maybe just to sort of pick up on the regulatory piece, I think it's important for us to, as companies, as civil society, as scholars, as researchers, as government, to really sort of roll up our sleeves and have the conversation and the nuance. And how do we kind of get to these solutions is not simple. But multi-stakeholderism is an important part of that work. And so maybe sort of teeing up my colleagues who are going to speak next, I think the industry has done a lot of important work through Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism and helping us coordinate and ensure that we are getting at the worst pieces of the content and doing so in a coordinated way, and also figuring out how we can best support smaller platforms and up-and-coming platforms so that they don't have the same learning curve that we have. We can sort of speed that up for them a little bit. And lastly, ensuring that we're staying in conversation with civil society and with researchers and scholars. We have a lot of resources inside the company where we are learning about these issues, but at the same time, we're doing that in concert with, in coordination with, in support of our colleagues outside of the companies that can help keep us abreast of all of the ways in which these trends are morphing over time. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
When we structured this panel, we agreed, or they agreed with me, that we would start with the large companies and then move to other organizations. We do have Nick Rasmussen with us, and he probably provides a perfect transition point. He is the founding CEO of the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, which has gone through a relatively recent transition in terms of its structure. So, Nick, why don't you talk to us a bit about the forum and the contributions that it might make, particularly since Courtney already looked in your direction and said Nick would be perfect to solve these big problems.
Well, it is appropriate that I perhaps pick up the conversation after my tech company colleagues have started, because what GIFCT, the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, is a coming together of industry, companies that have realized that there is more that can be done individually and collectively to prevent the use of the online environment by terrorists and violent extremists. And so even as they compete with each other across traditional competitive lines in the marketplace, there is this realization that there is work that can be done as a collective to share information, to engage in sharing of best practices, to support development of research, relevant research, and to engage in a host of joint activities that will together create a better and safer online ecosystem. And then I want to pick up, and so right now GIFCT is a consortium, a membership of approximately 17 companies, big and small, some of the biggest tech companies as you see on this platform, but also companies represented by one person, literally one individual in a room operating his service in a foreign country abroad. Those companies all come together around the simple idea that there is more that can be done to address this problem by working together than by working against each other. Now, I want to pick up on something else Courtney said in her remarks, and that is the concept here of multi-stakeholderism. That is a word that really didn't exist in my own personal lexicon up until about 15 months ago. And I've come to be a strong believer in the value and power of multi-stakeholderism. I think several of our guests, or several of the panelists and participants today, have spoken about whole of society solutions to the hate problem, and I think that the tech piece of that problem is no different. The whole of society piece suggests that solutions won't come from government regulation, they won't come from governments telling tech what to do, they won't come from tech deciding on their own what to do. They won't come literally from any one actor acting unilaterally. Where the solutions are to be found is in conversations that involve technology companies in the private sector, governments, to include law enforcement organizations, civil society organizations representing a whole host of different perspectives across a whole range of different societal objectives that we all have. And lastly, I would include in that multi-stakeholder conversation academia. We've talked again and again today about the dearth of data to describe adequately what we know to be intuitively a problem with hate globally, but we still struggle to get our hands around exactly what kind of problem are we actually trying to solve for. And so that multi-stakeholder conversation that I'm referring to is designed by GIFCT to be solution-oriented. It's not enough to convene a group of stakeholders around a table and simply admire a problem and continue to disagree with each other about the various solution paths. Ultimately, for multi-stakeholderism to hold value, it has to produce results. And so that is the challenge that I have as an organization in leading the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. Turn that multi-stakeholder conversation, work into a productive venue, lead the way in some ways in proving that it can be a real model for internet governance, or at least for discussing the difficult challenges of working in a digital age the way we all do, and do that by arriving at concrete solutions, not single swing for the fences solutions that for all time provide a single definitional framework, or that give one policy to be adhered to by every company around the world. That's not going to work. But to try to carry the conversation forward in a solution-oriented manner by involving as many of the different stakeholders as we can possibly get around that virtual table. And I would say, lastly, in closing, if anything, the COVID environment has made it easier for me over the last 15 months in running this organization to do just that, because there's no obstacle to setting up a Zoom meeting with pretty much anyone in the world that I want to talk to.
Or a Teams meeting.
Or a Teams meeting.
Thanks.
Fair point. But literally, I'm not constrained by travel, because literally I can talk on a given day to colleagues in Australia, Singapore, Japan, Ghana, Egypt, London, Brussels, and of course Silicon Valley and Washington as well. So that's where the conversation needs to be had to solve these problems, and that's what GIFCT exists to do.
But just to be clear, Nick, you're not talking about expanding the membership of your own organization so that it fits the multi-stakeholder model. You're talking about your organization reaching out in one way or another to other stakeholders.
Actually, both. I mean, while I'm very proud that we have 17 GIFCT member companies, we need more. As we've heard from several of the experts today, the problem of extremism and hate on the internet or in the online environment exists all over the place. The bad guy migrates to where the weak points are, migrates to where terms of service are either muddy or fuzzy and allow for that activity to take place. There are more companies that need to be brought around this table. So I would argue very much that we need to, and also this is a global phenomenon. Extremism exists all around the globe, and it's not just a question of bringing Silicon Valley into the conversation or even Western democratic countries into the conversation. This needs to be a global effort.
Can I prompt you, as well as the Independent Advisory Committee, Nick?
Yes, and for that reason, we have created an independent advisory committee that brings all of those different voices in a structured way so that they can contribute to that conversation and help set the agenda for the organization.
And does that committee include academia and the other kinds of organizations, and not different sizes and types of companies.
Indeed, it does. It includes prominent academic experts in the extremism space, as well as some representatives of governments, as well as some representatives of civil society organizations. It's meant to be reflective of that multi-stakeholder environment. Now, you can never be as representative as you want to be and as inclusive as you want to be. That's a constant effort to widen the circle even more.
Megan, it must have been music to your ears when Nick talked about data, because I know that getting data and getting the best data is a big concern of yours, and you're also very interested in learning more about the process of radicalization online.
Yeah, thanks. Data certainly is a concern of mine. I come out of the cybersecurity field, but also trained as a data scientist, a data miner, we used to call it. So very accustomed to building giant data sets. I currently have data infrastructure in place for, I think it's 32 platforms at last count. So very interested in all of these companies represented here, as well as a lot of the smaller ones that we haven't heard too much from yet. Research questions are always at the forefront, so thanks for mentioning radicalization. That's always a research question that's of interest to me. It's one of the first ones that got me started in studying hate and extremism. I started studying those questions on Facebook back in, I think it was 2016, and quickly built out a data set. Back then you could do that on Facebook. So I quickly built out a data set to study one particular event. It was the Unite the Right event that was happening in the summer of 2017. As soon as I heard about it, I ran my first data collection on June 20th and ran it 12 or 13 more times, I guess, over the course of the summer. By the time the project was finished, I had 2,000 hate groups over 10 different ideologies, and there were 700,204 user accounts represented there. Some of the groups were quite large, some of them were small, but they were all degrees of separation from that original Unite the Right event. And then I set about trying to discover about the ideological crossover between the groups and the radicalization pathways that the members of those groups had taken to get where they were. Unfortunately, the data was, that data package that I was using, the API from Facebook, was discontinued in the wake of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. So my big dreams for a longitudinal data analysis of online radicalization quickly came to an end, and I had to look at other platforms, which is why I have so many data collectors now and such a variety of different platforms. It really forced me to have to get more creative. So I've begun studying different types of questions too. Financing is a big one. I did a huge study of Proud Boys, about 8,000 Proud Boy adherents on Facebook, plus another 200 of a hand curated data set on the platform Venmo. It's like a payment processing system, and they were using it to take dues. So that was a really exciting project. I was able to build out a data set and then develop a prediction model to actually determine who the leaders of the group were and who the followers were. And it had pretty good success. I think there were only like 2 false positives and a handful of false negatives in that prediction model. So it was pretty interesting. After that, I moved to studying video live streaming and the money that was being made there. So I don't know if you remember hearing about during the insurrection that some of the folks that were actually live streaming the events there during the Stop the Steal, there were all these sort of live streamed, in real life events all around the country, and folks were actually making money live streaming those events for audiences, for paying audiences. So I decided to study that phenomenon, something that was kind of new, and I didn't think people were very familiar with how much money was being made there. The data was unfortunately not available from the most popular live streaming platforms, which would be YouTube, Twitch, that sort of thing. So I had to turn to, get a little creative again, and I had to turn to a platform that was much smaller, but the data was available to study. And it also happened to be the sort of platform of last refuge for some of the folks who'd been kicked off of the more mainstream platforms. So I set about collecting data, and I think I got data from 150 different streamers, as well as mega donors, which I didn't even know there were mega donors, so there were some findings right away on that project, very exciting. But when all was said and done, I had several 100,000 data points, numerous months and months of collecting their accounts and every transaction, every payment. that went to these live streamers for promoting this hate and extremist content. And I guess the findings, the things we learned were how the communities were set up around promoting and financing these types of groups, and how financing actually turns into, I guess, a fan club style. It's an activity that they get to participate in. If they're not going to be in official groups anymore, then they can at least be in fan clubs. And we learned how much money was actually exchanging hands for the first time using this video live streaming technology. Some of the streamers were making well over $10,000 a month, and some of the donors were donating in the tens of thousands of dollars. Numerous nights where they would donate $2,000, $3,000 at a pop. So lots of learning there. Other platforms that I've been studying include cryptocurrency. I guess that's not a platform, that's more of a technology, but lots of work to be done there. Other radicalization engines, I guess, podcasting is one that I've done an enormous amount of work on. It's taken years and years, but building up a big data set of podcasters, how they spread propaganda and memes that way. How they use encrypted platforms such as Keybase and others to do encrypted discussions. How popular is that? What kind of things do they discuss and then delete? Gaming platforms like Steam and so on. So lots of work, lots of data, lots of missing data, lots of data I wish I could have, but I don't. Those are the biggest challenges that I face. Probably would be, of course, the time to do the work. But the biggest challenge, I can just repeat it again, is accessing the data, getting what we need to answer the questions that we have about this very complex socio-technical phenomenon. So.
Marc-André is the true Canadian on the stage. He's got a maple leaf lapel pin, and his only disappointment in Pittsburgh so far is he couldn't get tickets to the Penguins game tomorrow night. And you should know, when anyone named Marc-André comes to Pittsburgh, everyone immediately thinks of Marc-André Fleury, who was our great goalie for so many years. But in addition to hockey, Marc-André, our Marc-André, has interests in this area too, including interests in data, particularly as the uses of platforms are changing, and also has an interest in a topic that arose in the civil litigation session earlier this afternoon, that is how to better measure the harms that actually are suffered by humans faced with the misuse of technology. Marc-André?
Thank you very much for having me, and happy to be here because I look at all researchers who've kind of molded my career, so it's a little intimidating and interesting at the same time to be here with them. But data is something that's very important. Nick was right, there's a dearth of data. And at GNet, we're the research arm of the GIFCT, trying to get rapid fire research out by academics to provide important insight on the fly as the field of violent extremism adapts to this changing space. And at a time, even though you have a dearth of data, it could be a boon, but it could be a curse, because it comes to the challenge of how much can you trust the data if there are gaps, if you can't get access to all the information that you need to do your models and your research. And as much as each platform has different forms of data, each threat actor uses these platforms in a very different way. And it's easy to focus on a single platform and point to specific issues, but in reality, they function in these ecosystems. And you need to be able to get the information that you need to examine these behaviors in a way that it looks like how they use all of these holistically. So if you have a threat actor, he's not only going to be on Facebook, he's not only going to use Xbox Live to game with his other extremist buddies, he's going to stream on YouTube, he's going to use Twitter to send content out, he's going to be on DLive to share his extremist propaganda, he's going to be on Parler, he's going to be on Gab, he's going to be on Telegram. There's a multitude of platforms that a single user will use. That talks about a user journey, and that needs to be examined across all of these platforms to better understand the process of radicalization. If we want to be solution-oriented, as is the objective of this event, as a researcher and as a member of a think tank, we need to be able to have the information that we need to support the work of GIFCT, which supports the work of the platforms. And it really comes to having access to information that when I'm using it, I know that it is reliable and trustworthy so that my results are not skewed, because the end of the day, the impact that it'll influence how the platforms will dictate what is and what is not on their platforms. It'll impact how the public perceives a specific group or specific ideology. There are consequences to that, and it really comes down to the information we use. So my first challenge, I guess, to provide here is, what is a way that we could provide the research community the type of information that is needed to better inform our research, so that those who are practitioners and those who need to make informed decisions are actually being informed by data that is trustworthy and reliable consistently, so that if I produce research, it could be reproduced by another researcher. We don't need to use janky ways and weird code that is ethically dubious at times to scrape information that we need. If there is an attack, we don't need to scramble in groups to look for the attacker's social media accounts, archive everything, scrape it, and share it between each other. There needs to be a system in place where we could do both quantitative and qualitative research. It's not only about having data sets of the back-end data, but it's also understanding human behaviors. How are they functioning? Why did an individual radicalize? What was his user journey? And that is a challenge, because there are ethical and human rights implications when it comes to accessing that data. But it also provides very important information to understanding how an individual got to where they are. And I think one of the challenges, figuring out a way that we could function in this space together and collaboratively. And by doing so, it'll give us the capacity to do another important thing, which is measure harm. It is something that is very difficult to do, and being online in a lot of these ecosystems, it's challenging, but at times it's very important to understand that there's a lot of awful but lawful content, to borrow phrasing from a colleague of mine, Aaron Saltman. And as much as it's there, this is my favorite phrase to say, it's not illegal to be an asshole on the internet. It's not. And it's something that we, up to in a way, have to accept. And we need to understand that the way that we will deal with what we perceive to be as threat actors here and how we research them has repercussions in other places. So we need to understand that when we're measuring harm, we need to have concrete evidence so that we could dictate, yes, this research is sound, this is the real impact. It's not just, a small impact that we have. I want to say, what is the real impact of anti-Semitism? How do we measure these type of harms? How can it be used so that if we want to have civil litigation, we can measure that, we can provide that information. If we want to make policies for platforms on the impact of the movements that Brian was talking about, groups like QAnon that have a spectrum of harms and a spectrum of individuals within it, how do we measure that type of harm? Some of them are not what I would detail as threat actors, they're just extremists, but on the same spectrum, you have some who are virulent anti-Semites and who are willing to commit acts of violence. And so within one movement, there's different ways to approach it, and that needs to be properly measured so that when policies are made for dangerous conspiracy theories or different type of dangerous movements, we're able to deal with the behaviors and the content in an appropriate way. Because as all the platform says, Facebook, Twitter, Google, Microsoft that are on stage here may have the same threat actor, but they will be using the platform differently, and their behaviors and their usage will be differently. So there's not a one-stop shop solution, but it needs to be a communal one. The same way that we need to have a mixed method approach to our research, there needs to be a mixed method approach to how we deal with them at this multi-stakeholder level. And I think the work that GIFCT is doing is very important, because it is bringing the platform, civil society, researchers, and governments together to tackle these very difficult issues, but also in a space where we could have these conversations and really try to push these issues forwards. So continuing this, but then finding a way to provide us with what we need, I think is an important step forward.
Vidhya, your colleagues at Moonshot told me you were willing to talk about a lot of important things. Assessing what the tech companies were doing well and what they weren't doing so well. Talking about things like the possibility of deplatforming and the providing of safer alternatives, and that you also might be positioned to say something about the risks that are present and emerging from the far right.
Thank you. I was going to say I can't stand by anything my colleagues said in advance of this, and I see them sitting over there, but everything you said sounds reasonable, and I'm happy to speak to that. I thought I might quickly start off by giving you a bit of information on who Moonshot are, because I had a great conversation out by the coffee where someone said, Moonshot, that's a messaging app, right? So I just want to set the record straight. We are not a tech platform. We're an independent organization, and we work with the tech companies. We also work with governments and with NGOs around the world to build an evidence base around the scale and the spread of terrorist, extremist, violent, and harmful content on those platforms. But we also work with those partners specifically to engage audiences online who are at risk of hate and violent extremism, at risk of perpetrating, sharing, and engaging with that content, and who may pose a risk. What we do is we build safeguarding mechanisms, we connect them in with safer alternatives, and so I'm going to speak a little bit about that today. So much of the focus of the conversations around the tech companies has been on moderation, and that's important. We do know that deplatforming works. There's a huge evidence base to demonstrate that to date. You know, going back to 2019, many of you will remember when the EU pushed forward a Telegram takedown, really targeting ISIS networks. It took them a long time to even, and they still haven't rebuilt anything near where they were prior to those takedown efforts. So we know that deplatforming works. But it's not enough on its own. If we're going to effectively manage hate content on the platforms, and if we're going to actually deal with these risks and how they present in the real world, we need to accept two things. First, there will always be content that falls in the gray zone and is not liable for removal, and that's been mentioned already by a few of my other co-panelists. Second, there will always be some spaces on tech platforms that are not liable for moderation. And actually, I mean, Google search is a great example of this. You can enter anything you'd like into Google search. Google's not going to stop you from typing in words for terrorist content. It can affect the algorithms, of course, around what you see, but Google search in its own right is not a space where moderation is necessarily a possibility. So for these cases, in addition to their moderation efforts, tech companies are in a really unique position to deliver safer alternatives to audiences who are presenting their risk online. And this is what we work with the tech companies to do. We've worked with Facebook, we've worked with Google, we've worked with music streaming platforms, with content sharing platforms, and the smaller tech companies alike to offer users safer alternatives. And I should say here, this is not new. This is a model that the companies have employed across a range of different other online harms. In particular, there's a lot of learnings for us from the suicide prevention space, from dealing with child sexual exploitation online. Our view is that every platform should be adopting similar measures to safeguard audiences who are at risk of violent extremism and hate. These need to be designed extremely carefully, guided by do no harm principles and guided by evidence. But there's a lot of evidence that we can build on to date. Moonshot's a 6-year-old organization, so any of the evidence that I present here really is built off of the last 6 years. But there's also a lot we can learn from what has worked offline, and we can try and take those learnings into the online space. Behavioral health methods, which are now widely accepted as effective approaches to dealing with potential perpetrators of violent extremism and hate in an offline setting, so counseling, one-to-one engagement with those individuals, social work methods. These are methods which can be applied in the online space, and it's not about policing thought, it's not about telling people what to think, or even engaging with the ideology. It's about taking someone who is potentially at risk of violence and connecting them in with someone that they can speak to. And I really want to emphasize the someone, because we can connect people online with individuals, with counselors who can actually have a conversation with them. It doesn't need to just stop at watching a video online or reading a website. One of the models that we developed in partnership with Google, and this goes back now 5 years ago, enables the use of commercial advertising to reach people who are demonstrating through their Google searches that they're, if they're looking for hate content or extremist content. And now, 5 years into deploying that method, we've now taken that method onto a range of other platforms and done a huge amount of testing. In particular, we have some really fascinating findings from the last year in the US alone. We ran, during a 4-month period from the election through the insurrection and through the inauguration, during what was, as you all know, an incredibly polarizing period in American history. We were using that methodology across platforms to reach out to Americans who were searching for white supremacist content, armed group content, conspiracy theory content, and hate content, broadly speaking. And not just people who were searching for this content, people who were watching the videos, who were liking the videos, who were sharing that content. We had a huge sample size. We reached people over 100 million times, people who were searching, engaging that content during just a 4-month period. Now, a huge sample size allowed us to pull some statistically significant results. And what did we learn? We learned that you can effectively address the underlying drivers through messaging with these audiences online. The most engaging message that we tested with those audiences during that period was a message that said anger and grief can be isolating, and connected people into services to support a move away from violence as the answer. One of the most effective pieces of content that we ran, that we redirected people towards, was a mindfulness exercise. It was a breathing exercise that walked people through a 30-second, just a kind of breathing, the breathing motion and reflection on themselves. So many of the people that are going down this path are dealing with underlying feelings of anger. And actually, the thing that's going to help us solve that problem is not necessarily tackling the ideology, it's connecting them in with someone who can help and who can de-escalate them from violence. Now, during that same period, we also set up a 24/7 helpline service. It was text message based, and we offered that to hundreds of thousands of Americans across the United States that, once again, were engaging with this content across platforms. We've channeled over 100 Americans into text message counseling sessions. This model is still live right now. And really fascinatingly, over 15% of those that we sent to this website, which offered a text message-based counseling session, over 15% returned to the website on their own accord. So they either bookmarked it, remembered it, and came back to it. So once again, goes to show if you offer services to these audiences, they might just think about it and might just take it up when they're ready. So in addition to their moderation efforts, tech companies are in a really unique position to use the power of their platforms to deliver these kind of alternatives to people who genuinely need to see it. And we recently evaluated Facebook. Facebook set up a pilot program to redirect white supremacists into exit service offers. They did function as a conduit between over 200 high-risk users and that service. And this is, I should say here, it's still very much in pilot mode, and I know Facebook's looking to expand it. And we're going to be doing what we can to support that kind of experimentation. We're also working with music streaming companies to offer mindfulness and self-help content to people that are trying to engage with hateful content on those platforms. And importantly, I should just mention here, this is experimentation. It's experimentation based on an evidence base. There will be mistakes, there will be learnings, but I genuinely believe that these platforms are not just spaces for us to fear. They're not just spaces where hate content runs wild. These are some of the greatest tools that we have in our fight against extremism and hate. So, we will hold the tech companies to account, and I have spoken very openly on my critiques of the tech companies in the past. But I also want to use these tools to their full potential and ensure every single person on these platforms who's demonstrating through their behavior that they are at risk of violence is offered a safer alternative. And I do believe that we can work with the tech companies to make that happen.
Thank you very much. That's a nice note at the end of your remarks. And it would be inappropriate for me in my role to say that I have saved the best for last. So let me say instead that I have saved the most positive for last. As you may recall, when she introduced herself now some time ago, Susan Abrams indicated that she was the CEO of the Illinois Holocaust Center, and she wants to give you some sense of how the center is using technology to develop empathy and basic humanity. Susan?
So, as Mark said, we are using technology a little differently than we've been discussing this afternoon to date. We are combining it with powerful historical storytelling to do just what Mark identified, to help people develop empathy and an understanding of our common humanity. So essentially, we're trying to prevent people from becoming those extremists who we've been talking about all day today in various forums. and to help people realize the power of their voices and choices to speak out for what's right. We heard the phrase repair our world, and to become those upstanders as opposed to bystanders, again, speaking up for what's right and against what is not. Let me give you an example of that. Imagine sitting across from Auschwitz survivor Fritzi Fritschall as she recounts her harrowing story of the Holocaust, in which she, as a 13-year-old young girl, was ripped from her home with her family and taken by rail to the notorious concentration camp. She would share with you how she was separated from her mother and two brothers, never to see them again. And you could ask her questions about her Holocaust experience, or maybe about those brave upstanders who risked their lives to save hers, or even maybe, what is her advice for us in our world today? Well, now you don't have to imagine it, because you can do it through interactive holograms. After years of working on this project in partnership with USC Shoah Foundation, I stood at the back of our holographic theater as the first group of students and educators walked in. They took their seats and the lights dimmed, and a brief introductory video began in which Fritzi narrated some of her story. She shared how at an Auschwitz work camp, she was one of 600 women, dirty, head-shaven, and hungry. She was the youngest among them, and so those other 599 women each night would line up, and they would give Fritzi one crumb from their meager bread rations, hoping that because she was the youngest, that she might be able to survive and share their story. In exchange, Fritzi promised them that if she survived, she would do just that and tell the world what was happening. She then leaned forward in her seat in this brief introductory film and said, "But I have so much more to tell you, so please ask me questions." There was the briefest of pauses as the program switched to interactive mode, and that sunk in with the audience. And then one hand went up, and then 3, and then 5, and question after question was answered by Fritzi's hologram. Take a look.
So does anyone have a question for Fritzi? What was the hardest part of your experience in the concentration camp?
I thought I would die when I was walking towards the gas chambers. I thought I would die when I didn't have enough food.
I tried to hold it in, but there was a point where I just asked my question and I just couldn't hold it in anymore. I mean, I just feel like she's such a brave person for being able to sit up there and explain her story to anyone and everyone who was able to listen to the story.
It felt like Fritzi was right there on the stage. I didn't know. If my teachers didn't inform me that it was a hologram, I would have never known.
I feel like it makes people realize that they can make a difference and they can do something in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
What do you think? Amazing, right? And what do we know? We know when people are engaged in an activity, not passively watching or listening, that experience can be imprinting. People feel it, in this case, often viscerally. Remarkable technology makes this experience possible. Fritzi was filmed before 100 cameras. Custom voice recognition software and Pepper's Ghost projection all contribute to the experience. And these experiences allow you, the viewer, to walk in somebody else's shoes, developing that sense of empathy and that understanding of our common humanity. The exhibition opened to rave reviews. It was named one of 12 must-see exhibitions globally by Smithsonian Magazine. It was featured on 60 Minutes twice and in media globally. Fritzi's legacy was assured. She had kept her promise to those 599 women. And yet, Fritzi worried, and I worried too. Fritzi's worry was that one day Auschwitz, that harrowing horror from her past, would not be maintained, that it might be allowed to decay or even be redeveloped as so many had been, which would decimate, again, that proof in her mind, and we have so many deniers today, that proof of what happened to her and to millions of others. My concern was a little bit different. Having seen the power of the application of technology to historical storytelling, my team and I were thinking deeply, what else could we be doing? What else should we be doing while we still have time? You probably know our survivors, you could certainly do the math, are in their 80s and 90s, and so that window is absolutely closing. The answer to both Fritzi's and my concern turned out again to be technology, only this time it's virtual reality. Virtual reality would allow us to take the viewer on this journey together. Now, you're not just sitting opposite Fritzi in a theater, but imagine standing with her on the grounds of Auschwitz as she shares about how she arrived and was pushed off of the train and separated again from her mother and two brothers. Or stand with her in the barracks as she tells you how each night when she was hungry and cold and scared, her Aunt Bella would put her arms around Fritzi and she would whisper softly, "Tomorrow will be better. Let's just live until the morning and you'll see, tomorrow will be better." Once again, you, the viewer, drive the experience. And here's part of the beauty. Technology makes these experiences scalable, so ultimately, millions can have this opportunity to walk in somebody else's shoes and see the world from their perspective. Let me give you one other brief example. In 2015, the United Nations commissioned a VR film highlighting the plight of Syrian refugees. So, through the power of storytelling and technology, the viewer is placed in a refugee camp in Jordan where 12-year-old Sidra takes you on a tour and shares her family's experience. It turns out that this experience was so powerful that it changed the way the UN thought about supporting refugees. So now, broaden from there and imagine how different could our world be if we all learned about history in this way. Could we eradicate the hatred and fear of others that we've been discussing? No longer bound by the constraints of geography and time, viewers, users could meet change makers, history makers, and eyewitnesses, exploring these new lenses and perspectives. As Elie Wiesel reminds us, whoever listens to a witness becomes a witness. And as Amanda Gorman poetically challenged us at President Biden's inauguration, for while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us. So that's a little bit of our museum's vision for how we can use technology for the good. And I know Laura, we all heard Laura mention earlier today that we have these displays available here for the 3 days of the conference. So in rooms, I think it's 308 and 310, we have virtual reality in one and a two-dimensional version of our interactive survivor biographies or holograms. And I hope people will join us and give it a try. So thank you. Back to you, Mark.
And those displays, those displays are in rooms on either side of the bridge as you're kind of coming across to this part of the convention center. Well, let me say We could have done a whole segment with any one of you. And it's great that you all were here and willing to contribute in such meaningful ways. And again, can we have a big round of applause for this panel?